Hello, everybody. My name is Kyle Wiley Pickett. I'm the music director and conductor for the Topeka Symphony, and this is Behind the Baton virtual edition number. I guess we're on two or three here. I'm recording from a home office space here, but I am pleased that so many of you are able to tune in and watch Behind the Baton on your own computers, and I'm very grateful to the library for hosting this program for us. And what we do here in these Behind the Batons is a chance for me to talk to you directly about the music that we're performing, about some of the things that I'm thinking about when we put these pieces together. Sometimes when we have a soloist, we bring the soloist on and interview them as well. But today it's just me, and I am going to talk to you about our concert, which is on Saturday night here with the Topeka Symphony. And we are playing on this performance the Rite of Spring, Igor Stravinsky's seminal modernist ballet, one of the pieces that is most famous in the orchestral repertoire, partly because of the music itself, partly because there was a scandal and a riot in the theater on the first performance of this piece, and partly because it's one of the most difficult and spectacular works in the repertoire. This is the 75th anniversary season of the Topeka Symphony, and of course we all know that we are in the midst of a pandemic right now, hopefully heading toward the tail end of the pandemic so that we can get back to live Behind the Batons and larger live audiences for our performances. And so being the 75th anniversary, I wanted to choose some pieces that would really showcase how far we've come as an orchestra, and there's really almost no better test for an orchestra than Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Before I go any farther, I will just mention that we are continuing to follow safety protocols for the symphony. We are continuing with our masking, with our social distance spacing on the stage, and this concert we are also unable to have a live audience in the hall with us. So this performance will be live streamed only. We will perform it as a live concert, but there will be no one in the hall. People will just be able to watch at home on their internet streaming providers. And that's disappointing. It would be fun to have people live in the audience, but it's most important that we continue playing and that we keep everybody safe. So that's how this performance is going to happen. There are three pieces on this concert this week. We are opening with a piece by Modest Mussorgsky, a Russian composer like Stravinsky. It's his Night on Bald Mountain, sometimes translated Night on Bear Mountain. And that piece was made most famous in Disney's original Fantasia, as was actually the Rite of Spring, also featured in Fantasia. Night on Bald Mountain is a tone poem, meaning it doesn't follow the structure of a symphony or a sonata. And it's a storytelling piece. It tells an old Russian tale about a demon who wakes the dead, and it's an exciting piece. And part of what's exciting to me about pairing Night on Bald Mountain with the Rite of Spring is that without Mussorgsky, without his raw Russianness, without the rhythmic impulses that he brought to classical symphonic scores, we might not have had Stravinsky in the same form that we do with the Rite of Spring. But it's a very familiar piece, and so I'll just leave it at that right now. I will also mention that we are featuring our Young Artist Auditions winner, Nina Haramilo, who is a young flutist, and she is playing a piece by Cécile Chaminade, her Concertino for Flute and Orchestra. And this is a very special piece to me, but you know what? I'm going to jump into the Rite of Spring, and then I'll come back to the Chaminade at the end of this broadcast. because I have a couple little personal anecdotes that I'll tell about that. So let's talk about the Rite of Spring. Um, you know, there are pieces like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, ba 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 bum, that are familiar to the general public, whether or not they happen to be fans of symphonic music, whether they are aficionados of the orchestra, just because they are in the public consciousness. They're part of cartoons. Everybody knows the sound ba 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 ba. The Rite of Spring is another one of those pieces, although probably less familiar from a musical perspective than it is from a cultural perspective, because it was a piece of classical music that caused a riot at its premiere. And many people know that story, or at least have heard of that story, and that's what they remember and think about the Rite of Spring. But the Rite of Spring is pretty much, it's pretty simply a ballet. It is a Russian ballet. It's in the tradition of Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, or the Cinderella, or Swan Lake. There's a great Russian tradition of ballet music, and there was an impresario named Sergei Diaghilev, who brought his Russian ballet troupe, the Ballet Russe, to Paris, and they were in residency in Paris. And Diaghilev is not a household name, but in the music world, he deserves an awful lot of credit, because he is responsible for some of the greatest orchestral music of the transition between the 19th and 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. He commissioned, meaning he paid composers to write scores for his Ballet Russe, and he commissioned people like Debussy and Ravel, and of course Stravinsky. And so pieces like Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, or Debussy's Jeu, or Stravinsky's Firebird and Petrushka and Rite of Spring were all commissioned by Diaghilev, and so he left us a great trove of orchestral music. Of course, they were all ballets, but these pieces are performed more frequently by orchestras in concert settings than they are by ballet companies in ballet performances. So we're very grateful to Diaghilev for this. Well, Diaghilev recognized the talent of a young Igor Stravinsky, and commissioned from him first a ballet on the subject of the Firebird. And this was one of those collaborations and that resulted in a worldwide hit instantaneously. The Firebird launched Stravinsky's career and launched him as a new voice in modern music in, again, the early 20th century. And Stravinsky told the story that as he was finishing the Firebird, the idea for a new ballet on the subject of pagan Russia and a springtime ritual in pagan Russia came to him, that he thought that might make a good subject for another ballet piece. And that was the first seed that was planted that ends up with the Rite of Spring. So Stravinsky, in his Firebird, and then again later in Petrushka, was able to meld ideas of Russian folk music into classical style, with an outstanding sense of how to use the orchestra in what we call orchestration, which is a composer's choosing which instruments are going to play what at what time, so that the musical ideas are communicated to the audience through the medium of the orchestra. That's orchestration. And he turned out to be a master orchestrator. He knew how to get new sounds, beautiful sounds out of individual instruments and combinations of instruments in ways that people had not heard before. So when he started to pursue the idea of this ballet, the Rite of Spring, at Diaghilev's commission, he was going to be paired with Nijinsky, the modernist Russian choreographer, and they created a story of pagan Russia. And I'm going to read to you the summary that Stravinsky provided for us. This is what Stravinsky prepared as a text for the original program. He said, "The Rite of Spring is a musical choreographic work. It represents pagan Russia and is unified by a single idea, the mystery and great surge of creative power of spring. The piece has no plot, but the choreographic sequence is as follows." And it's in two parts. The first part, the Adoration of the Earth. The spring celebration. The pipers pipe and young men tell fortunes. The old woman enters. She knows the mystery of nature and how to predict the future. Young girls with painted faces come in from the river in single file. They dance the spring dances. Games start. The spring Khorovod, a stately dance. The people divide into two opposed groups. The holy procession of the wise old men, the oldest and wisest, interrupts the spring games, which come to a stop. The people pause, trembling before the great action. The old men bless the earth, the kiss of the earth. The people dance passionately on the earth, sanctifying it and becoming one with it. And then we have the second part, which is called the Great Sacrifice. At night, the virgins hold mysterious games, walking in circles. One of the virgins is consecrated as the victim and is twice pointed to by fate, being caught twice in the perpetual circle of walking in rounds. The virgins honor her, the chosen one, with a marital dance. They invoke the ancestors and entrust the chosen one to the old wise men. She sacrifices herself in the presence of the old men in the great sacred dance, the Great Sacrifice, or the Danse Sacrale, which ends the ballet. So Stravinsky says there's no story to it, but he then goes and tells us a story. It doesn't necessarily have a linear plot, but the basic idea is that the people of pagan Russia come together to celebrate the coming of spring, and they do it by choosing a virgin who sacrifices herself to propitiate the gods of spring in a sacrificial dance where she dances herself to death. So it's a fairly brutal story, and because of that, Stravinsky writes some brutal music to go with it. And as I already mentioned, we know that there was a riot that happened at that first performance. Whether that riot was based on what people were hearing or not is of great question. I sort of incline to believe that it was not. As a matter of fact, there is a fair amount of evidence that the riot was pre-planned by those who wanted to protest modernism or new music and performances. In fact, the press release that went out into several Paris newspapers before the day of the premiere was tantalizing, and it gave references to the, quote, stammerings of a semi-savage humanity and frenetic human clusters wrenched incessantly by the most astonishing polyrhythm ever to come from the mind of a musician. And it promised, quote, a new thrill which will surely raise passionate discussions, but which will leave all true artists with an unforgettable impression. So they were primed to create scandal with this premiere performance. I want to play a little bit for you, and I'm going to give an example here. I'm going to play a couple examples that come from the Joffrey Ballet's recreation of the original production of the Rite of Spring with the dancers. And you will be able to see the colors of the costumes. The costumes and the makeup were recreated based on photographs, and the dances were recreated based on notes from Nijinsky's original choreography. And you'll be able to see, as well as hear, some of this version of the original performance. And quite frankly, when I first saw this, I knew the score long before I saw this Joffrey recreation, and I was a little put off by the dancing. It didn't match what was in my head, and I think that a lot of the initial response had more to do with the dancing than it did with the music. But I'm going to play a couple segments for you. The first one comes right after the opening of the ballet. The opening of the ballet happens with this amazing solo for the bassoon that is written way up at the very, very top register of the bassoon. The bassoon is a baritone bass instrument in the wooden section of the orchestra, and it's playing a line that is up in the range where clarinets or flutes or oboes could play. It's haunting and it's gorgeous. I'm not going to play that for you right now. You'll have to tune in to see the broadcast for that. So I'm going to play the first set of dances, those round dances, and let you see that. So let me start sharing my screen here, and I will let us watch for just a moment this first set of round dances. So, okay. And here we go. Okay, so that gives you a sense of what that choreography was like, and it also gives you a sense of what that music sounds like. And there are a couple characteristics of this music that are revolutionary, or at least revolutionary in the way that Stravinsky used them. He used some techniques. One of them we call polytonality, where he takes two separate keys, two chords from two separate keys, and plays them at the same time. Poly meaning many, tonality meaning key areas. And so rather than, one chord of C, dun dun dun, dun, it's a chord of, add a C and an E flat chord at the same time, and chun 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 chun, and you hear those polytonalities making that really crunchy sound. He also uses this idea of polyrhythms, where there are different rhythms happening at the same time. Likewise, he uses punctuations. So sometimes instruments, rather than playing something that's melodic, they're playing something that's very much more like what a percussion or a drum section would do. In the beginning, it's actually fairly straightforward. Even though those rhythms, those punches sound out of rhythm, it's fairly straightforward. It was he wrote it in 2/4. So for us, we're playing 1 and 2 and 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 1 and 2. So he's just given us accents within the 2/4. Later, he breaks rhythm apart, and at the end, for the sacrificial dance, he creates a whole new language of rhythm, and he had to come up with a way to notate it in a way that made sense. I'm going to sing a little bit for you, and then I'm going to play it for you so you can see this. At the end, rather than just a straight 2/4, his rhythm pattern is so outside of the norm that he had to create a way of notating with micro measures. So in a normal measure for us might be 2/4, meaning 2 beats in 4/4 time. In this next section, he creates a segment that's 2/16, 3/16, 3/16, 2/8, 2/16, 3/16. I'll hold it up. I don't know if you can see it on the screen here or not, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of the complication of it. And so for us, we play ba 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 da 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 ba 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 da da da, and it sets up the frenetic dance where our chosen girl dances herself to death. And so let me play a segment of that. I'm going to have to set up to share that screen here. And I'll get that going. Okay, here we go. I think I've got it. So this is a segment of the sacrificial dance here. And let me start sharing. Okay, here we go. Okay, so that gives you a sense there of what that sacrificial dance is like. It is so difficult. It is so hard for the orchestra. And in fact, in the original performance, the dancers rehearsed for 6 months to get ready for this premiere, and the orchestra had 17 rehearsals. So for a professional orchestra to get 17 rehearsals, just to give you a perspective, we do it on 5 rehearsals here. And they had 17 rehearsals to prepare that first performance. It's an amazing piece of music. I want to show you one more clip because I think this is really kind of fun. I mentioned The Riot, and there was a film that came out a number of years ago called Coco and Igor, about the relationship between Coco Chanel and Igor Stravinsky. And in that movie, they actually they recreated the riot scene of the premiere of Rite of Spring, and they did an amazing job by all accounts. I mean, they've really captured what that was like. And so I'm going to share my screen again and show you just a small clip from that film so you can see that. Okay, getting ready here. Let's see. I will get this one set to go. And oops, let's try this again. All right, here we go. And so this is a recreation of the riot scene. So that gives you a sense of what was happening there. And you know, apparently there were a couple things that happened. One was that there were pro Stravinsky and anti in the audience. They were yelling at each other. One side was yelling, "Let them finish," and the other was saying, "Stop this madness." They were yelling so loudly that apparently you couldn't hear the orchestra. Pierre Monteau, who conducted the premiere, apparently just was able to tune out what happened behind him and just led the orchestra through as though nothing were going on behind him, but the dancers couldn't hear the music. And so Nijinsky stood in the wings and shouted counts to them. So he was counting to the dancers so they could continue their dance. Diaghilev went and was turning the lights off and on in the audience, trying to get people to settle down. It was a madhouse. And then it launched this piece into music and cultural history. You know, at the previews there was no riot, and then from the second performance on, no riot. It was really something that seems like it was staged for effect on that particular day. So, the Rite of Spring. Let me just mention a couple things before I close about the Chaminade Concertino that our young artist is playing. This is a wonderful piece. Cécile Chaminade is an outstanding composer. Beautiful piece for the flute. Many of you know I'm a flutist as well, and I had the privilege to study with Frances Blaisdell, who was a lot of people called her the first lady of the flute world. She was the first woman to be a full student admitted to the Juilliard School. She was the first woman to be a full-time member of the New York Philharmonic. Just a marvelous, marvelous person, great musician. And she told me the story that when she auditioned for Juilliard, for one thing, she was able to get the audition at Juilliard because they misspelled her name, wrote it down Frances with an I. They thought she was a boy. So when she showed up and she was a girl, they said, well, you can't audition, but she talked her way in. And she auditioned for the flute teacher of the time, Georges Barrère, one of the great French flutists, and she played the Chaminade Concertino for him. And she said after she was done, he sat and looked at her for a long time and then said, you are to be admitted to my class and you are to have full scholarship. And that made her the first woman student at Juilliard. And so fast forward many, many years, and when I went and auditioned for Frances, not knowing any of the story, I played for her the Chaminade Concertino, and she admitted me to her class. So it's with great pleasure that that I get to accompany Nina here with the Topeka Symphony in the Chaminade Concertino. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you again to the Topeka Library, and we will look forward to seeing you at the Topeka Symphony, well, seeing you online for the Topeka Symphony's 75th anniversary season production of the Rite of Spring. Thank you so much.